Washington lands a top transfer tackle.
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into a special bonus edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Roman Tomashoff. That's not Lars Hansen. That's Spencer McLaughlin, the one and only, the legend of Locked On College Football, joining me on a special bonus show on this Thursday afternoon. Thank you for making this your first watch or first listen today, as we are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And Spencer, we're coming at the everydayers with a special bonus show because Washington just landed a transfer from one of the best offensive lineman transfer portal prospects. That's Kansas State's Carver Willis, played right tackle for him for the last 2 seasons. We're talking about where he slots in on this offensive line and what else Washington might do in the portal. It's a fun discussion, and you look at some of these numbers, he's really solid. 3 sacks, over 620 pass blocking reps at Kansas State over the last 2 seasons. Honorable All Big 12 mention, honorable mention All Big 12. A lot going on here in 2023. What do you think of this?
I think it's essential for Washington to be in that discussion. By the way, I love that you introduced me as host of Locked On College Football and definitely nothing else. So
yeah, that's it.
That's all there is to it. But it's pretty easy to watch this Washington team and not think that both trenches need to be improved dramatically. The offensive line, of course, stood out in the Oregon game with 10 sacks. That tied a program record for Oregon in a single game. And yeah, that Oregon defensive line is really good. But then the very next game that Oregon played, their defensive line got manhandled by Penn State, who ran for 292 yards and only allowed 1 sack and not a whole heck of a lot of pressure with Drew Aller back there. So I think that's an example of where Washington has to get their offensive line back to. And, you know, you and I talked on what was then Locked On Pac-12, RIP, a season ago about how the unheralded part of Washington's amazing 2023 run was the offensive line. And then they won the Joe Moore Award, and you and I were kind of looking around telling people, like, see this right here? We told you they've got a bunch of time. So, I mean, this is probably the biggest need. Like, I in the games that I watched Washington this year, of which there were several, the defensive line needs help too. But I'd go to the offensive line before I went to the defensive line because, you know, you can win a shootout if you have an offensive line, but you can't win a shootout if you don't have an offensive line. And so if you don't get into that position in the first place, then having a weak defensive line isn't quite as much of a weakness for the wins and losses department. So I think it makes a lot of sense that they go out and get a guy like this. This is a pretty notable addition. I mean, Kansas State for the last couple of years has been built on one thing in particular, and that's the running game. You know, Avery Johnson, a quarterback, and DJ Giddens, and they brought in the Colorado transfer Dylan Edwards as well.
I'm a huge fan of his, by the way.
Yeah, I am too. And that's what they were built on. So having a foundational piece of that is a really big addition. I think more needed for Washington. They weren't one offensive lineman away, but certainly they are one offensive lineman closer to being what Jedd Fisch needs to run his offense with maximum efficiency.
So I certainly agree with you there. There's one thing you didn't mention in all this, and I think is the biggest key point. And that's Demond Williams, where you talk about needing upgrades on the defensive line as well. I certainly agree. We're going to get to that in a little bit. But when I look at this Washington team, it's about building around Demond Williams, something Lars and I have talked about on this show ad nauseum over the last couple of weeks. And when I look at this addition, that's exactly what it is. Where Washington signed 5 guys in the 2025 class. They got a couple of exciting redshirt freshmen. I'm a huge fan of Justin Hilkema's, somebody they signed in the 24 class that they brought with them from Arizona. And then you look at some other young offensive linemen on the roster. I think Maximus McCree, who played left tackle for Washington this past season, was solid until he dislocated his thumb against Iowa, which effectively ended his season. We haven't seen him since. We'll probably see him in a bowl game, but that's just where I kind of look at this and say, yeah, absolutely. You want to build around Demond. You talk about the Oregon game, 10 sacks in that game. What's going to, go a long way towards, I don't want to say solving those issues, but making them less of an issue. That's going to be a strong tackle. And again, Carver Willis, 3 sacks in 620 pass blocking reps. That's more than good enough for me. He's got 1 year of eligibility remaining. So I look at all that and I say, yes, this is the kind of guy you want to bring in for a sophomore quarterback that is, has been dubbed the future of the program. No pressure or anything there, but you're going to put those expectations on a guy. You need to make sure you protect him. And, Spencer, we talk about what this world of NIL is. You do a great job of covering all these things over on Locked On College Football. This is the kind of guy who you say, hey, you want to see somebody, pony up that NIL money for one of the best available offensive tackles, which are going for a premium, by the way. This is where you want to see those resources invested, and Washington did a great job of that. Now we need to talk about where he's going to fit on this Washington offensive line. Right after a message from our good friends over at Game Time, because Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets to your favorite teams play live even easier. Game Time Picks fills out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets, which is great news for anybody who wants to go check out Husky basketball, the Seahawks, the Kraken, any concerts that might be in town. Me personally, I'm going to be checking out for some Kendrick Lamar tickets when he's in town in May of next year. Super excited for that. But with Game Time Picks, curation makes it easier to save more on sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and so much more, whatever else is around. You got the all-in pricing with it. When you toggle this feature, it shows total upfront with no surprise fees at checkout. And with seat views, you can panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time Picks. Down the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKDOWNCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. So, Spencer, you got to look at this Washington offensive line. Right now, they're going to be replacing a couple of pieces where I look at this 2025 team, and I think that there's still a long way to go. Where Carver Willis does not have a lot of experience at left tackle. Where, some people might say, hey, he might slide in over there. I just talked about Maximus McCree a minute ago. I don't know if 60-something snaps, which he has over there, is going to say this is a left tackle, but you look at him on the right side, Drew Ezepardi, who was, one of the hotter transfer portal names last year at offensive tackle. Maybe you bring him to the bench, you let him compete in the offseason for a starting role, but you pencil Carver Willis in at right tackle right now, and then you do some shuffling up front with, Landen Hatchett probably moving over at center, and you're going to have most likely 2 new guards with Guard Memolar in the transfer portal and Enoch Vamahai being out of eligibility.
So one thing that's interesting about the transfer portal, and I've seen this with just about every single team. Offensive lines are not built through the portal. Who's been the biggest transfer portal story in the last 2 years each offseason, or one of the biggest stories? Colorado,
I'd say your Oregon Ducks.
Oregon is certainly up there, but
sure.
Even along Oregon's offensive line this year, 4 out of 5 guys are homegrown, and 1 guy is a transfer. Who has been the biggest portal team? Colorado. Right. So Colorado is building their roster through the transfer portal. Do you know what Colorado hasn't had either of the 2 years that Deion Sanders has been there? A good offensive line. They haven't been able to run the ball. They have not been able to protect Shedeur Sanders. They were better this year, but the floor was, he was sacked 50 times last year. 5-0. Was it might have been 50 something. I don't even remember. It was some obscene number of sacks. So the offensive line, like bringing in Carver Willis, I don't think you bring him in if if it isn't a plug and play situation. That's what most transfers are. Not all. Some guys are depth pieces, and that's okay. But for Willis, I think he's got to come in and start right away, because I don't know. I mean, you could tell me, but I doubt there is a better option waiting on Washington's roster right now to slide in and start at tackle. But this unit up front is still going to have to be built through high school recruiting and development, because the number of players, impact players, that are available every portal cycle along the offensive line, Roman, it's a small number nationally. I agree. It's a really small number. The most abundant positions are wide receiver, defensive end, and corner, I would say. The least abundant positions, and I'd kind of put quarterback is in between, because a quarterback's not as high by volume, but by percentage, it's closer to defensive end than it is offensive tackle. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
Like you can go and say, look, we're going to have a transfer quarterback each of the next 3 years. That's okay. You only need 1. But when you're looking to fill out an offensive line, you need 5 guys. You cannot find 5 starters in the transfer portal every single offseason. So that's what I'm curious to see, is he slides in to be one piece, but who do they develop to be the other pieces? Because you can't just bring guys in and hit the portal to say, well, that's how we're going to build an offensive line.
So I certainly agree with you there, and that's not the plan. Like it's certainly not the plan where I look at, the only other starter that I truly see right now for the 2025 season is Landen Hatchett at center, where it seems like that's certainly going to be the plan in the middle. That's a guy that, was recruited under Kalen DeBoer's staff. And that's the interesting thing about where Washington's roster is right now, just in terms of still somewhat reeling from the fallout of Kalen DeBoer leaving, where we saw both tackles from the Joe Moore award-winning offensive line go to the NFL draft. That was always going to be the case with Roger Rosengarten going to the second round. He looks like just a fantastic steal right now for the Baltimore Ravens, by the way.
He's great.
Love seeing that. And then Troy Fautano was a first-round pick. We all knew that was going to happen. That was not shocking. And then the interior, that goes the way it did. But you have to remember, they also lost several depth pieces to the portal. Landen Hatchett, who did come back, he was somebody that he went to Oklahoma for the 2024 season. Jalen Clem was a guy that Scott Huff seemed to like. He went to Arizona State, I believe it was. And so they were losing so many pieces. And Jedd Fisch has had to really piece this together. And I look at, the future. I like Paki Finau, former 4-star recruit. He looks like somebody who might be able to slot in a guard spot. That's a guy that Washington did a really good job of retaining after the whole transition from DeBoer to Fisch. And I look at this 25 class and I say, this is why Jedd Fisch and co invested so heavily in the offensive line. I look at guys like Peter Lange, John Mills, Champ Talia, where all of these names are players that they might not be impact players right away, but in terms of what you need to compete in the Big Ten on the offensive line, the size and all that is there. So if you can, say, hey, we need a guy at 2 other positions to mitigate for the 25 season, and then we know it's full go on the offensive line with all these players we've recruited over the last 2 years of 26, great. But when we talk about Carver Willis, this is that stopgap to get him there. Again, in his final season of eligibility. So I look at that going forward, and I say, yeah, they're in a really good spot for this, but there's still a whole lot of other upgrades that need to be made, which we'll get to right after a message from our good friends over at FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything needed to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Thursday Night Football is coming up fast. Jawan Jennings, that's the guy you need to know tonight on Thursday Night Football. He just absolutely torched the Rams the last time these two teams met. Like he's over in catches, like he's over in yards, and give me an anytime touchdown. He's going to thrive tonight. Go check out all those odds and so many more over on FanDuel. So, Spencer, you talked about the defensive line earlier. That's a position that I'm really interested in as well. Love to get your take on the matter.
Yeah, I mean, is there anybody on this Washington defensive line you look at and say, yeah, definitely has to be back next year, or the defensive line is going to be significantly worse off? Because unlike offensive, I think there was one guy, you got to help me with his name, but he was balling against UCLA.
Are you talking about Russell Davis?
I think so. The
edge rusher, 3 sacks?
Yes, that one. So that's the guy you say, okay, sure. But the defensive line, unlike the offensive line, and again, Colorado's a great example of this, you can go and find it. I think a big part of it is abundance of talent, first of all, and I think a secondary component is it doesn't take as much chemistry to play defensive line as it does offensive line.
I agree. Yeah.
You've got to have snaps and continuity. Defensive line, though, and this is, largely true for most defensive positions, it doesn't require as much coordination as the offense. That doesn't mean it requires none. I watched Oregon secondary against Penn State blow several coverages that led to explosive, consequential plays for the Nittany Lions. So the defensive line is just go find guys that can line up and contribute right here, right now. And the Buffs were able to do that. And, Oregon's done a good job in the portal along the defensive line. They, again, have a blend of high school guys and portal, but certainly their defensive line is far more portal dependent than their offensive line, which is mostly high school grown talent. So there are a lot more players. Defensive line, I think defensive end more than defensive tackle, but there are some impact defensive tackles that move each season, to be sure. But there are just a lot of guys that play edge, a lot of guys that come up from the group of 5 ranks as well that make an impact. I think about a guy like Chris Hardy, who transferred to Ole Miss and was a part of their defensive line this year. Yeah. They were really good on that side of the ball. He transferred from, I believe it was Jacksonville State ahead of this season. And that's just an example. Whereas on the offensive line, are you going to go find a bookend starting left tackle? Probably not. Could you find a rotational or decent starter interior guy? Yeah. That's a lot easier to find, but offensive linemen just don't seem to move as much. I don't know exactly what it is. It could be that they don't get the ball, so they're more comfortable, not seeing the field as often, or they understand it's more of a developmental position. But, skill positions, you can find them every single year. Quarterbacks, it's not as strong of a market this year as it was a year ago. Everyone's waiting for John Mateer to hit the portal. He might not. Yeah. But, Friday's episode of Locked on College Football, I talk about the prospect of him going to Miami. Why? Well, because the last Washington State guy that went there is currently going to New York City for the Heisman Trophy ceremony. So right. I think that there are enough defensive linemen out there to where Washington should feel, okay, we can go out and fill this position group to at least maybe not be top 3 or 4 in the Big Ten and have, what Oregon has, what Ohio State has, what Penn State has every year. But maybe we feel like we can go out and at least get it to the point where it's average to above average. Whereas, correct me if I'm wrong, for the most part this year, Roman, I think it was a net negative.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, especially as the season wore on, where Zach Durfee got hurt on the edge, Javon Parker got hurt on the interior, the depth wasn't there in the way you'd like it to be. And you make a really interesting point, Spencer, where, something Lars and I have talked about, where you want to go out and get a traits guy. Where like a Jere Bledsoe from Texas, who's visiting Washington this coming weekend, that's a guy who's got the upside, who's got all the athleticism that you might like. And then on top of that, go get, like you said, from Jacksonville State, somebody like that, who's got the production that you can trust to say, yeah, we've seen this guy make an impact. We trust our coaching staff to help him be able to bring that to the FBS level. Anything like that, those are always pieces that you're willing to find. But there's an interesting caveat on top of that too. It's if you talk to any director of player personnel out here on the West Coast, whether it be Washington, Oregon, USC, UCLA, they're going to tell you, hey, we're not happy with where the defensive line talent from the high school ranks is on the West Coast right now. That's become a major struggle. We see USC going to try to dip into Georgia every year to try to take defensive linemen because that's the state of just defensive line recruiting on the West Coast. So it's something where it's
the West Coast is about quarterbacks, especially.
Yeah,
are out west. Receivers, I think, are pretty heavily out west. But
yep.
If you look at Oregon's, if you look at Oregon's defensive line, let's see, Tatum Tuiyoti's from the state of Oregon, Mateo Uiagalelei is from California. Everybody else, all over the place. Jamari Caldwell was JUCO in Texas, Houston, Oregon. I forget where I don't think he's from the West Coast area originally. Derek Harmon, Michigan State. Jordan Birch is from the South. Like they're like that. That's a great point. Is that if you want to recruit this position, you've got to leave the Oregon, Washington, California footprint.
Spencer, thank you so much for jumping on this bonus show. Make sure that all the Everydayers got to go subscribe to you over on Locked On College Football. Make sure you subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. So that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere. We're updating the channel with new content every single day. So make sure you click that like button, click that little bell so you didn't miss when we post bonus shows like this one. Make sure you leave a like on the video, comment down below who you want to see Washington get in the transfer portal. And if you're audio only, leave us a 5-star review. All those things really help us out a lot. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you on Friday.